July 19th, 2019. It's Friday evening in St. Paul, Minnesota, a city of 300,000 just across the Mississippi from Minneapolis.
St. Paul is considered the more tame part of the Twin Cities, where it's not as vibrant.
It's kind of the little sister of Minneapolis, but we're very proud of it here.
It's a little bit smaller, but in some ways it's more ethnically diverse.
You have more of a working class structure.
But that Friday evening, one hardworking St. Paul mom has inexplicably vanished. It's a little before 8 o'clock when Wanda Dixon gets a call from the daycare that looks after her friend Jessica Williams' youngest daughter.
Hello?
Hi, I'm trying to reach Jessica Williams. Do you happen to know where she is?
Wanda was her close friend, her old neighbor, and her emergency contact.
No. Is everything okay?
But Jessica hasn't picked up her daughter.
We close at 6 and it's already 7:45. We really need someone to come pick her up.
All right. I'll be right there.
Right away, Wanda was wondering, my goodness, what's going on? Something must be wrong. So Wanda volunteered to go over to the daycare and pick up Jessica's child.
Then she drove straight to Jessica's.
Jessica! Jessica, are you home?
Eventually, the two older daughters come to the door.
Girls, hey. Where's your mama?
They didn't know where their mom was. So Wanda walks into the house,
All right, I'll be right back.
trying to find Jessica.
Jessica?
She was calling out for her. Jessica, where are you? Jessica, you in the house?
But when she reaches the kitchen, Wanda stops in her tracks.
Oh my God.
She sees blood splattered everywhere.
There was drag marks across that blood. Those drag marks work their way down the stairs to the basement.
Oh my God.
Jessica Williams always put her children first.
She was a wonderful mother, and there was nothing more important to her than her family.
Although she was little more than a child when she first became a mother.
Jessica had her first child at the age of just 18 with her high school sweetheart.
She had met a boy named Rodney Crawford a few years earlier, and the two of them had fallen head over heels in love.
She felt excitement, nervousness. There was a lot of emotions there.
The couple faced plenty of challenges, too.
If being teen parents wasn't already difficult, they had a daughter who was born deaf.
Oh, she did it!
Now you have to learn how to communicate, you have to find special services. She did that. Her daughter was thriving.
Jessica and Rodney went on to have two more daughters.
Jessica was a woman who could take on anything.
But raising three kids put a strain on the relationship.
They were financially struggling. They were having stresses.
After years of trying to make it work, Jessica and Rodney just didn't work out anymore.
They ended up splitting and going their separate ways.
But through every hardship, Jessica never stopped fighting for her children and herself.
All right, ladies.
Jessica never seemed to quit. She seemed to decide that I am going to do more. I'm not done here.
She got a job as a home health care aide, and she had a lot of aspirations.
The biggest of them involved her lifelong passion for music.
Everyone who knew Jessica knew that she loved music. So it was no surprise to anyone that in 2019, Jessica pursued a bachelor's degree at St. Paul College in music.
For Jessica, it was just one more challenge.
To go back to school when you have 3 kids and you are now in your late 20s, that's a really difficult thing to do.
It really does show a resilience that I think we don't see that much of.
But now, after a phone call claiming that Jessica has failed to pick up her youngest from daycare,
I'll be right there.
Jessica's friend Wanda has made a horrific discovery.
She went to the house to see what was wrong.
Jessica?
Everything seems okay until she gets to the kitchen,
Jessica, where are you?
where she sees a pool of blood on the floor and streaks of blood leading down to the basement stairs.
However, she doesn't follow the trail of blood.
Oh my God!
She doesn't know if there's somebody in the house.
Girls, you okay?
So she got the kids outside just for their safety. And then she called 911.
Police arrive on the scene within minutes and make their way inside.
It appears that someone had been dragged through the kitchen down into the basement.
And when they go downstairs, they find Jessica's body.
They had a murder on their hands.
After splitting with her high school sweetheart, Rodney Crawford, 27-year-old Jessica Williams was pursuing her dreams and raising 3 children as a single mother.
And she had started taking classes at a local community college.
Jessica was a single mother, so it took a lot of courage on her part.
Jessica was the type of young lady who was always trying to find that perfect balance in life. So she was determined to still make things right.
All right, I'll be right back.
But she would never get the chance.
Jessica? Jessica, where are you?
After her friend Wanda found a bloody scene in Jessica's kitchen,
Oh my God!
she called 911, and then police arrived to search the rest of the home.
When they go downstairs, that's when they find Jessica's body. Her t-shirt is wrapped over her head and her face.
And when they go to take the t-shirt off of her head, they see that she'd been shot in her neck and in her head.
When homicide detectives arrive on the scene, they determine that Jessica has been dead several hours.
Rigor mortis has already begun to set in.
They were able to see that this was not something that just happened.
Based on the blood, it appears that Jessica had been killed upstairs.
When the officers go upstairs, they find an empty gun case on the couch and 6 .22 caliber shell casings in the kitchen area.
As they looked around, they could see a trail where it appeared a body had been dragged along the kitchen to the basement.
It's unclear if by dragging her in the basement, the killer had hoped to cover their tracks.
But for whatever reason, the killer left the rest of the kitchen untouched.
Maybe they ran out of time, or just realized it was hopeless.
Still, the detectives believe there's at least one thing the killer did in order to cover their tracks.
Jessica's cell phone is not actually on the scene.
Which suggests that the killer may have been in contact with Jessica prior to the murder.
And it's not the only thing about the scene that suggests the killer was someone Jessica knew.
The fact that the killer covered Jessica's face showed an emotional reaction.
Leaving crime scene techs to process the house, the detectives canvass the concerned neighbors who have gathered outside.
None of the neighbors recall seeing anything out of the ordinary.
I did see a guy taking out the trash last night. I just assumed it was her boyfriend.
Several neighbors say they've seen the man around the house before.
He was tall, slender, he had dreadlocks.
Neighbors weren't sure where the man had gone, but they had an idea how he got away.
Neighbors told the police that Jessica's SUV wasn't in the driveway.
Had the mysterious man with dreadlocks killed Jessica and made off with her SUV?
Then called up her.
The police put out a bolo and they made a request. Whoever is driving that vehicle, stop them.
Then, after issuing the bolo, the detectives returned to the homicide unit to take statements from Jessica's daughters and her friend, Wanda Dixon.
One of the questions that people would be asking is, if both girls were in the house, why didn't they hear the gunshots? The fact is that a .22 is not that loud. Dropping a book on the floor is about the same audio level as that.
And the 10-year-old is deaf.
Well, just let me talk to these girls real quick, okay? If she could kind of translate for her then. What do you want me to tell? Just grab a seat right up there, it'd be perfect.
When the detective questioned the two girls, they knew something was wrong, but they really had no idea what had happened.
Did your mom wait to get up this morning?
No, she's gone.
Where was she?
I don't know.
The girls say they spent most of the day just playing in their room.
They're not sure what's going on, and they're waiting for an adult to show up.
After talking to the girls, the detectives turned to Jessica's friend Wanda, who's still distraught over the news that Jessica is dead.
So I'll give you a second here to decompress, because clearly you've had to keep all this in for the kids. I can only imagine how difficult this is.
Once Wanda regains her composure, the detectives start off by asking how she knew Jessica.
I was her next door neighbor and a very good friend, and the kid got bigger.
Wanda also explains how she was Jessica's emergency contact for things like the kids' daycare.
Which turns the questions towards the kid's father, Rodney Crawford.
What can you tell me about him? Mr. Wonderful. That's what I always think of him. When they first moved in, he seemed very nice.
But according to Wanda, her assessment of Rodney had eventually changed.
She started to see their relationship deteriorate.
I remember one time she having money at my door and she called the cops. She put a gun on my dad who was going to kill me.
Detectives investigating the murder of Jessica Williams have learned from her friend Wanda Dixon that the mother of three had a turbulent relationship with her ex, Rodney Crawford.
There is a lot of tension and potential violence in that relationship with the father of her children.
There's allegations of abuse.
He said he had a gun in my head. He also had a knife and he was going to kill her.
Wanda, call the cops.
Wanda says she had called 911, but Rodney left before the police arrived.
They interviewed her and took pictures and everything like that.
Wanda says that Jessica didn't press charges against Rodney, but the relationship was never the same.
And Jessica realized at that point, I don't need this. This isn't good for my kids. Rodney and I, we need to split up.
Jessica got a restraining order against him. He was really not allowed to come anywhere near her.
However, Wanda also says that in addition to the restraining order, Jessica had also bought a gun.
Jessica, somewhat understandably, felt like she needed a gun for her own protection.
Considering that the detectives found an empty gun case in the house, they start to consider that Jessica might have been killed with her own gun.
Question is, was it Rodney who pulled the trigger?
This was a violent relationship. The fact that there was an order for protection in place shows his ability to be threatening. There was allegations that Rodney put a gun to her head. All of that started to check boxes for the police.
However, Rodney isn't the only person the detectives need to consider.
A neighbor said she saw a young man there before.
The police got the description from the neighbors of a tall, thin man with dreadlocks, and that doesn't sound like Rodney.
But the detectives don't know his name until they ask Wanda if anyone other than Rodney had reason to hurt Jessica.
But it's not him. My next suspicion would be the Sebastian guy. And who is the Sebastian?
According to Wanda, Sebastian is Jessica's new boyfriend.
How do you know his name's Sebastian? That's what the girls told me. Do you have any idea how long they were together? Maybe 3-4 months.
Jessica had described it as casual, but Wanda suspected that it was actually a lot more serious than Jessica was letting on.
You don't know anything other than that? No.
Wanda doesn't know his last name or what he looks like.
But the detectives suspect that Sebastian is the man with the dreadlocks that the neighbors say that they saw at Jessica's the night before the murder.
However, before the detectives can track him down, they get a call from dispatch.
Jessica's SUV has been located.
It was a few blocks away from Jessica's home.
The doors were locked, the key was not in it, and they touched the hood of the car and it was cool to the touch, so they could tell it had been parked there for quite some time.
So you have this locked vehicle, no one inside, and the police didn't want to act prematurely, so they sat back and watched that vehicle for a period of time to see if anybody would go over to it to get in and drive it.
But the vehicle appears abandoned.
No one got inside. No one approached the vehicle.
They did tow it down for evidence.
They send the car to be processed by forensic technicians.
While forensics gets to work on Jessica's car, detectives try to get a last name for her boyfriend.
They want to talk to Jessica's family to see if they can get any more information about the Sebastian guy.
Detectives also contact Rodney, who agrees to come in for an interview.
When Rodney arrives to the station, he's surprisingly inconsolable.
I'm like, you okay, baby? Yeah, Daddy, I'm okay. Mama dead. There's a lot of blood on the floor of the kitchen.
He feels a ton of guilt.
Detectives investigating Jessica Williams' murder have just sat down with Rodney Crawford, Jessica's ex, and the prime suspect in her murder.
There was a history of domestic violence in the relationship.
Wanda, call the cops.
Eventually, she had to get a restraining order.
He tried to kill me.
But in the interview room, Jessica's ex doesn't act like a killer.
He cannot believe that the mother of his children is dead.
I'm so sorry, sir.
But are his tears genuine, or an attempt to divert suspicion?
Detectives question whether or not it's sincere.
Put on the spot, Rodney doesn't deny that he and Jessica had their problems.
He admits that they broke up when Jessica was pregnant with their youngest child because he had gotten another woman pregnant.
Rodney even admits that there was violence between them.
However, he denies having anything to do with the murder.
He says he hasn't even seen Jessica in months.
Jessica put a restraining order against him, so he hasn't had any communication with Jessica or his daughters.
That's when I lost all contact with. Okay. So the last domestic case was the last time you were with her. Did you communicate with her at all as far as kid stuff at all, anything like that? I couldn't.
Next, the detectives move on to Rodney's whereabouts for when the murder likely occurred.
Can you tell us where you were? We just want to get a timeline of everything.
Rodney says he was at his new girlfriend's house.
You were there, so their family until now.
Yeah, like me, like my son. While she went to work.
You were there the whole time?
The detectives also ask Rodney about Jessica's new boyfriend, Sebastian.
You know who the boyfriend is?
He hasn't heard anything about this new guy.
I couldn't talk to her, so I had to block her everything. So I went on social media and I went on nuts.
But he also suggests that the new boyfriend is behind Jessica's murder.
He says that had he not been unfaithful, she wouldn't have left him, she wouldn't be deceased.
The detectives aren't entirely sure they believe him, but for the moment, they play along.
You gotta not blame yourself here, pal. You can't control other people's actions.
Then, to test if Rodney's grief is sincere, the detectives step out of the room for a few minutes.
But inside the room, the tape is still rolling.
When detectives leave Rodney in the interview room, they're observing him.
The whole time, Rodney was just crying.
He is overwhelmed with sadness, feelings of guilt and shame about what he could have done differently.
He's the best actor on the planet, or this guy really is broken up.
Still, the detectives do follow up with Rodney's current girlfriend to see if her account matches his.
She says, yes, that's correct. He was there taking care of the kids. I came home from work, and then we were both home the rest of the evening together.
At that point, Rodney was officially cleared as a suspect.
So the question becomes, okay, who did it?
To answer that question, the detectives focus their attention on finding Jessica's new boyfriend, Sebastian.
They only have a first name, but the detectives hope that once they get Jessica's cell phone records, they can confirm his identity.
But before they receive the records, Jessica's sister Ebony arrives at the station.
Ebony tells them that yes, Jessica did tell her about this new guy she'd been dating.
They went to St. Paul Cottage together.
He was also pursuing a degree in music.
Although according to Jessica's sister, his name isn't Sebastian.
His name was Shabazz. You know his full name? Nope, I just know him as Shabazz.
That's why the kids had it all Sebastian, Shabazz, that's kind of cool, but it was Shabazz.
Can you describe him for me? He's African-American with long dreads. He's about 6 feet. Slim.
This is likely who the neighbors saw at Jessica's house.
But Ebony says Shabazz isn't Jessica's boyfriend. He's her ex.
And she told me she broke up with him.
What, baby, what?
According to her sister Ebony, murder victim Jessica Williams had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Shabazz.
Ebony said, I think that's the guy you want to talk to. He's trouble.
Did she mention any problems with any other boyfriends?
Ebony says that Jessica and Shabazz met at the community college they both attended.
They were both non-traditional older students, so they were kind of drawn towards each other.
But Jessica's sister says she was less than thrilled with Shabazz.
She did have some reservations about their relationship.
There was something about him that just felt off to her.
kind of crazy because he talks for himself and stuff. He's kind of schizo.
Ebony says she was glad when Jessica told her she and Shabazz had split up.
The Thursday prior to her death, Ebony asked about Shabazz, and Jessica explained that they had broken up recently, and Shabazz was no longer living there.
But according to Ebony, Shabazz wasn't happy about it.
He was angry about, them breaking up and stuff.
She's certain that this guy is the person responsible for murdering her sister.
After interviewing Jessica's sister, the investigators redouble their efforts to find Shabazz.
The police looked through Jessica's social media, and they find someone in her friends list named Shabazz Miller.
They find out his full name is Shaki Shabazz Miller Brantley.
He is tall, thin, with dreads. He's exactly the description that they had been given.
After a bit more digging, the detectives are able to track down an address for where Shabazz lives with his mother.
John, the car, we gotta go.
Please have a seat.
Although when the detectives arrive at the apartment complex, the manager seems surprised to learn that he's staying there.
Oh no, he better not be living here. I had so many issues.
Shabazz has caused so many issues with the neighbors, within the complex. There's been complaints. Shabazz's behavior is so unacceptable that they've told his mother that he absolutely can't live with her.
She's the only one on the lease and the only one who can live in the apartment.
However, the apartment manager admits it's possible Shabazz has been sneaking in and out.
He's not going to be coming through the front door because he doesn't want anyone to know he's there.
Luckily, there was surveillance on both entrances.
Can we take a look at some footage?
Yeah, sure. I'll pull it up now.
They see Shabazz at the back entrance, and the landlord says, "That's him."
100% sure. That is Shabazz.
It's time-stamped for Friday at noon.
Can we get a copy of this?
Yeah, sure.
Which fits the timeline of the murder.
Since Jessica did take her youngest daughter to daycare on Friday, the detectives believe that the murder occurred sometime mid-morning.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Convinced they've found Jessica's killer, the detectives establish surveillance outside the apartment.
Because they don't see him exit again, they're making the assumption that he's probably still inside of his mother's apartment.
Then they secure an arrest warrant and prepare to take Shabazz into custody.
They had to use a SWAT team to go in because they don't know his state of mind. They don't know if he's going to come out shooting.
Sheriff's off. Get out, get out, get out, get out!
Since it wasn't at the scene, he may still have the murder weapon in his possession.
But all their precautions prove unnecessary.
They were able to arrest Shabazz without incident.
They bring him down to the station. His mother also comes down to the station so that she can give her own statement.
But first, the detectives conduct a thorough search of the apartment.
They find a .22 caliber handgun in a kitchen drawer.
They found Jessica's cell phone, and they also found a pair of men's sneakers that were bloody.
After searching the apartment, the detectives head back to the station and sit down with Shabazz's mother.
Understandably, she wants to know what's going on.
Well, the reason why I have you here is that Jessica was found dead.
Shabazz's mother confirms that Shabazz had been living with Jessica until a few days ago.
He came through the door with a big bag of clothes, and he said she put me out. That's all he said. She put me out.
But the detectives are probably thinking he didn't tell his mother the whole truth.
Has he ever harmed anybody or hurt anybody that you're aware of? He's been in jail. He's on probation. What's he on probation for? When he did like attempted robbery like some years ago, he's been on probation for like 3-4 years.
But Shabaz's mother says her son's problems didn't end when he got out of jail.
She discloses that Shabaz has a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia.
She thought he was off his meds.
Do you think he could ever harm somebody like that?
It's possible. If he go crazy out of his mind.
Here we go, baby.
Get your stuff and go.
While talking with his mother, detectives investigating the murder of Jessica Williams have learned that her ex-boyfriend, Shabaz Miller Brantley, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
She says he's not taking his medications and he's not in his right mind. He could potentially kill someone.
Do you think he could ever harm Jessica?
I don't know.
But she does know that he was upset after the breakup.
Did he say anything to you about Jessica?
He said, I don't understand why she did me the way she did.
She asked him what happened and what was going on, what was wrong.
He told me we got into an argument the other day.
There's been a history of his mental health causing issues in his relationship, so she wasn't surprised to hear this.
She didn't know that there's a crime associated with this yet, but she figures he did something stupid.
And whatever it was, clearly bothered him.
Shabaz's behavior was really odd. He was pacing around, he seemed agitated, he was mumbling to himself.
He was like mumbling. You know.
She didn't know if these were just symptoms of his schizophrenia because he hadn't been taking his medication, or if something more serious had happened.
What did he do to her?
I can't get into that, really.
After talking to his mother, the detectives move on to Shabaz.
I think, you know why you're down here, we know why you're down here, we just want to get to the bottom of everything.
Detectives tell Shabaz that they're investigating Jessica's murder, and they suspect that he's involved.
I feel like you're a decent guy that, you want to get things off your chest.
Shabaz tells detectives that, yes, Jessica did put him out.
Why does she want to put you out? I don't need it though.
He thought Jessica simply wanted to see other people.
There had been an argument between him and Jessica, that they had gotten into a fight, but he says that argument ended and he left the house.
You can go. I am done with you.
I walked out on her.
But the detectives know that Shabaz isn't telling them the whole story.
Detectives then reveal to Shabaz that they found a gun in his apartment.
We've already found it in your apartment. Okay.
And Shabaz slowly starts breaking down and his story starts changing.
Shabaz tells detectives that he and Jessica got into an argument.
I am done with you.
Tripping out. Just kept tripping.
According to Shabaz, the argument turned threatening.
Yeah, and she had a bag on her. She was saying she gonna shoot me. She had a hair in her bag.
Okay.
It's a little bag she had.
All right.
She was carrying. She was saying she gonna shoot me.
He claims that he was afraid for his safety.
You better get your stuff and go.
She was telling me she would kill me.
He was fearful that Jessica was about to shoot him.
He tells detectives that he heard voices telling him, kill her first.
If I don't kill her first, she gonna kill me.
So Shabaz says he'd pulled his own gun.
He guesses he fired it 4 or 5 times.
You're saying that it was self-defense? Yeah. You thought that she had a gun? Yeah.
And he says it's only after he shot her that he realized it wasn't true.
He looked inside of the bag that she was holding for the gun and saw that there was not a second gun.
So I'm like, what the fuck? No, then you talk about you gonna kill me and all this. I just started crying and felt bad.
But not bad enough to call the police.
I tried to carry her down the stairs so the kids won't see it.
Shabazz says that he carried her body down the stairs, but it's pretty clear from the blood stains on the floor that she wasn't carried. Her body was dragged.
But he swears he never meant to kill her.
He said, the voices told me I had to kill her. It was the voices.
I've been hearing a lot of sure.
And when Shabazz goes on trial for murder, the entire case hinges on his mental state.
His defense team used mental health as his defense.
He stuck with this mental health claim that he was hearing voices.
He can say, look, I was off my meds and crazy.
The prosecution argues it wasn't voices that made him shoot Jessica.
Jessica simply didn't want to be with him anymore, and he didn't want to break up.
What? Just get your stuff and go, Shabazz. Don't tell me what to do.
He raised the gun and started firing at Jessica.
If he was truly defending himself, one shot would have ended the threat. The fact he continued to fire says that there was an emotional component to his actions. He had recently been dumped and thought she was dating other men. And clearly this was a rage-type shooting.
Which scenario will the jury believe?
He was found guilty of second-degree murder.
They did not believe his defenses for either self-defense or a mental health defense.
He was sentenced to 18 years in prison with 3.5 years credit for time served.
To Jessica's family, it's a small price to pay.
Minnesota only requires you to serve 2/3 of your sentence. Then you're eligible for parole. So he could conceivably be eligible for parole in 12 years. He gets credit for 3. So he'll be out in just a few years.
Shabazz will get the chance for a better future than he took from Jessica and her children.
When Shabazz gets out of prison, he gets to live his life all over again. What does Jessica get? What do her kids get? Nothing.
There are a lot of destroyed lives in this case. Jessica's first and foremost. But her 3 children who will never really know their mom or what their mom was capable of.
But it could have been prevented.
It's important to make sure that mental health resources are accessible to everybody.
There's a lot of warning signs that he was off of his medication and that he was not doing well and that he was acting odd. And I think when there's people in our lives acting that way, it's important to try to get help ahead of time so things like this don't happen.
If you or a loved one are struggling with substance abuse or mental health issues, there is help available. Call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at 1-800-6.
On the morning of June 20th, 2001, the quiet rhythm of a suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas, was interrupted by a phone call that would leave an enduring mark on American criminal justice, psychiatry, and public consciousness. The caller was a 37-year-old mother named Andrea Yates. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she contacted emergency services and then called her husband. Within minutes, police officers arrived at a modest family home expecting confusion, panic, or signs of a violent intrusion. Instead, they found an unsettling stillness. Andrea remained inside the house, waiting for them. She did not attempt to flee. She did not deny what had happened. 5 young children, all members of the same family, had lost their lives that morning. The victims were Noah, 7 years old, John, 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and 6-month-old Mary. They were siblings who had spent their short lives together under the same roof, surrounded by parents who had once dreamed of raising a large family guided by faith and traditional values. By the end of that morning, those dreams had been replaced by one of the most heartbreaking family tragedies in modern American history. As investigators began documenting the scene, another story slowly emerged beneath the obvious facts of the case. This was not simply the story of 5 murdered children. Nor was it a straightforward account of a calculating killer. It became a complex and painful examination of severe mental illness, postpartum psychosis, religious influence, medical treatment, family decisions, and the limits of the criminal justice system when confronted with profound psychiatric disease. Even decades later, the Andrea Yates case continues to challenge assumptions about responsibility, intent, and compassion. Legal scholars analyze the court proceedings. Psychiatrists study the medical history leading to the tragedy. Families affected by postpartum mental illness point to the case as a reminder that severe psychiatric disorders can become life-threatening if warning signs are overlooked or treatment is interrupted. At the same time, nothing about those broader discussions diminishes the immense loss experienced by 5 children whose lives ended before they had the opportunity to grow into adulthood. The events of June 20th did not unfold without warning. In hindsight, investigators, physicians, journalists, and legal experts identified numerous indicators that Andrea's mental health had been deteriorating for years. Hospitalizations, suicide attempts, severe depression, psychotic symptoms, and repeated medical recommendations all formed part of a troubling pattern. Yet understanding those warning signs after the fact is very different from recognizing how they appeared to the people living through them day by day. To understand why this case remains so significant, it is necessary to step back from the crime itself and examine the lives that preceded it. The story begins long before police vehicles arrived outside the Yates home. It begins with a young woman who was known for her intelligence, discipline, and quiet personality, and with a family whose aspirations reflected deeply held religious convictions and a commitment to raising multiple children. It is also a story shaped by medical decisions, personal beliefs, social isolation, and an illness that gradually altered a mother's perception of reality. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born in 1964. Those who knew her during childhood and adolescence often described her as responsible, academically capable, and reserved. She excelled in school and eventually became a registered nurse, a profession requiring both technical knowledge and emotional resilience. Friends and colleagues remembered someone who rarely sought attention and generally avoided conflict. Before her marriage, there was no history suggesting violence toward others or involvement with criminal behavior. In 1993, Andrea married Rusty Yates. Rusty had worked as an engineer for NASA before moving into the technology sector. By many outward appearances, they represented a couple beginning a hopeful chapter together. They shared strong religious convictions and envisioned building a large family. Their faith influenced many aspects of daily life, including parenting, education, and household responsibilities. Over the following years, Andrea gave birth to 5 children in relatively quick succession. Noah arrived first, followed by John, Paul, Luke, and finally Mary. Caring for 5 young children required constant attention. The family embraced homeschooling and sought to live according to principles emphasizing simplicity, devotion, and parental responsibility. For a period of time, the family even lived in a converted bus, before eventually moving into a small house in the Houston area. Although unusual, this arrangement reflected their desire to minimize unnecessary expenses and focus on family life. The household was busy, often crowded, and largely centered on the children's daily needs. As the family grew, however, Andrea's responsibilities expanded dramatically. Much of each day revolved around feeding children, maintaining the home, teaching lessons, preparing meals, and responding to the endless needs that accompany infants and toddlers. Opportunities for rest became increasingly limited. Social interaction outside the family also diminished, leaving Andrea with relatively little contact beyond her immediate household and medical appointments. Medical experts who later reviewed the case emphasized that postpartum psychiatric disorders exist on a spectrum. Many new mothers experience temporary emotional changes after childbirth. Some develop postpartum depression, which can be severe, but remains treatable with appropriate intervention. Far less common, but considerably more dangerous, is postpartum psychosis, a psychiatric emergency characterized by hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and an impaired ability to distinguish reality from false beliefs. Years before the tragedy, Andrea began showing symptoms that extended beyond ordinary exhaustion or stress. Following the birth of her fourth child, Luke, her mental health deteriorated significantly. She experienced profound depression, prolonged insomnia, self-harming behavior, and psychotic symptoms. She attempted suicide on more than one occasion and required psychiatric hospitalization. Physicians diagnosed severe mental illness and prescribed treatment that initially appeared to improve her condition. According to medical records presented later in court, psychiatrists repeatedly warned that Andrea faced an unusually high risk of future psychiatric episodes. Recommendations included close supervision, careful monitoring, and avoiding additional pregnancies, because another childbirth could significantly increase the likelihood of relapse. These warnings would later become a central point of discussion during both criminal proceedings and broader public debate. Mental illness, however, often progresses unevenly. Symptoms may improve for weeks or months before returning with greater intensity. Individuals can appear stable while continuing to struggle internally with distorted perceptions and overwhelming psychological distress. Family members may interpret temporary improvement as recovery, even when physicians remain concerned about long-term risk. Complicating matters further was the influence of deeply held religious beliefs within the family's life. The Yates family listened to sermons by traveling minister Michael Peter Waroniecki, whose teachings emphasized strict obedience, human sinfulness, and the spiritual responsibilities of parents. Those messages affected the family in different ways. Later psychiatric evaluations suggested that Andrea's severe psychosis incorporated religious themes into her delusional thinking, though experts also stressed that psychotic disorders distort personal beliefs in ways that differ fundamentally from ordinary religious practice. As the months passed, Andrea's condition became increasingly fragile. The death of her father in early 2001 represented another devastating emotional blow. Following his death, her symptoms reportedly intensified. She withdrew socially, ate very little, remained silent for extended periods, and displayed behaviors that deeply worried relatives and healthcare providers. She was admitted to psychiatric facilities multiple times, then discharged, only to experience recurring episodes. Looking back, many observers ask whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Could additional medical supervision have changed the outcome? Would continuous hospitalization have interrupted the progression of psychosis? Should treatment plans have remained more aggressive? These questions have no simple answers, but they remain central to understanding why the Andrea Yates case continues to be discussed in medicine, law, and ethics. This documentary follows the known evidence, court records, psychiatric testimony, and verified investigative findings surrounding the case. It does not seek to excuse the deaths of 5 innocent children, nor does it ignore the devastating impact on their family and community. Instead, it examines how an extraordinary convergence of severe mental illness, personal circumstances, and institutional decisions culminated in one of the most consequential criminal cases involving postpartum psychosis in American history. The story that follows is difficult not because it offers easy villains or simple explanations, but because it forces us to confront the painful reality that catastrophic violence can sometimes emerge from profound psychiatric illness, leaving behind questions that continue to challenge medicine, law, and society more than 2 decades later. When people first learned about the events of June 20, 2001, many searched for a simple explanation. Newspapers described the unimaginable loss of 5 children. Television broadcasts replayed images of a quiet suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas, while commentators struggled to answer the same question that echoed across the country. How could a mother do something so devastating to her own children? In the days that followed, investigators quickly established that there had been no unknown intruder, no kidnapping, and no prolonged criminal conspiracy. The facts surrounding the deaths were unusually clear. Yet understanding why they occurred proved far more difficult than determining how they had happened. To understand the case of Andrea Yates, it is necessary to examine the years before June 2001, not to excuse what occurred, but to understand the circumstances, medical history, and family environment that preceded one of the most widely discussed criminal cases involving severe postpartum mental illness in American history. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on July 2, 1964, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in what friends later described as a stable household. Those who knew her during her teenage years often remembered a quiet young woman who preferred listening over speaking. She was disciplined, organized, and academically successful. Unlike classmates who sought popularity, Andrea rarely attracted attention to herself. After graduating from high school, she pursued a career in nursing. Becoming a registered nurse required years of education and clinical training, demanding both technical competence and emotional composure. Colleagues remembered her as careful with patients and committed to her work. Nothing in her early adulthood suggested a tendency toward violence or criminal behavior. In many respects, Andrea appeared to embody reliability. She maintained employment, followed routines, and developed a reputation for responsibility. Friends described her as compassionate and deeply conscientious. Those qualities would later make the events of 2001 even more difficult for people who had known her to reconcile with the person they believed they understood. In 1989, Andrea met Russell "Rusty" Yates. Rusty was an engineer with a strong interest in technology and science. He had previously worked for NASA before later entering the technology industry. Friends recalled that the couple shared similar values and quickly formed a close relationship based on mutual religious commitment and a vision for family life. They married in 1993. Like many newly married couples, they imagined a future filled with children, stability, and shared purpose. Their plans reflected deeply held religious beliefs that emphasized family, faith, and personal sacrifice. They hoped to raise children within a household centered on Christian teachings, discipline, and close parental involvement. The Yates family was influenced by the teachings of itinerant minister Michael Peter Waroniecki, whose sermons stressed strict biblical interpretations of marriage and parenting. His messages encouraged large families, emphasized the spiritual responsibilities of parents, and portrayed motherhood as a sacred calling requiring complete devotion. It is important to distinguish these teachings from the psychiatric symptoms that Andrea later experienced. During her later psychotic episodes, mental health experts concluded that her illness incorporated religious themes into delusional beliefs. Such symptoms are characteristic of psychosis and should not be confused with ordinary religious conviction. The distinction became an important subject during both psychiatric evaluations and later court proceedings. Soon after their marriage, Andrea and Rusty began expanding their family. Their first son, Noah, was born in 1994. John followed approximately 2 years later. Paul arrived after that. Then came Luke. Finally, in late 2000, their daughter Mary completed the family. 5 children were born within roughly 7 years. The pace of these pregnancies meant that Andrea spent much of her adult life either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or caring for infants and toddlers. Medical experts later testified that repeated pregnancies, while not inherently harmful, can complicate recovery for women with a history of severe postpartum psychiatric illness. The family's lifestyle also differed from that of many of their neighbors. For several years, the Yates family chose to live in a converted Greyhound bus rather than a conventional house. The decision reflected financial priorities and personal beliefs about simplicity. The bus contained basic living accommodations, allowing the family to travel while maintaining a modest lifestyle. Photographs from that period show smiling children sitting together inside the unusual home. From the outside, the arrangement appeared adventurous to some observers and unconventional to others. Yet inside the confined living space, daily life required extraordinary organization. As the family continued growing, they eventually moved into a modest house in the Houston suburb of Clear Lake. The move provided additional room, but it did not significantly reduce Andrea's workload. Each morning began before sunrise. 5 children required constant attention. Meals had to be prepared. Laundry accumulated rapidly. Educational lessons needed planning because the children were homeschooled. Infants woke throughout the night. Toddlers demanded supervision every waking hour. For many parents, raising multiple young children is exhausting even with substantial outside support. Andrea had comparatively little opportunity for regular social interaction beyond immediate family members and healthcare providers. According to testimony presented later, she rarely took time for herself. Friends and relatives described her as devoted to her children. Photographs taken during family outings depict birthday celebrations, holidays, and ordinary moments of childhood. The children appeared healthy and active. Noah enjoyed reading and learning. John was energetic and curious. Paul and Luke were still exploring the world with the endless fascination common to toddlers. Baby Mary had only recently entered the family's life. Those ordinary family moments would later become heartbreaking reminders of lives interrupted far too soon. Behind the appearance of routine, however, Andrea's mental health was becoming increasingly fragile. Following the birth of Luke in 1999, she began experiencing symptoms far beyond ordinary postpartum exhaustion. She struggled to sleep. Her appetite diminished. She became withdrawn. Family members noticed changes in her behavior. Eventually, the symptoms escalated dramatically. Andrea attempted suicide by overdosing on medication. Later, she attempted to harm herself again using a knife. These incidents resulted in psychiatric hospitalization. Doctors diagnosed severe major depressive disorder accompanied by psychotic features, as well as postpartum psychiatric illness. Medical professionals recognized the seriousness of her condition and began treatment with medication, including antipsychotic drugs. For a period of time, the treatment appeared effective. Her mood stabilized. Her thinking became clearer. She resumed many daily responsibilities. To family members hoping for recovery, these improvements seemed encouraging. Psychiatrists, however, remained cautious. Medical records introduced during later legal proceedings indicated that physicians repeatedly warned the family that Andrea faced a significant risk of relapse. One psychiatrist specifically advised against additional pregnancies, because another childbirth could trigger another severe psychiatric episode. Recommendations also included close supervision and careful monitoring of Andrea's mental state. These recommendations reflected established medical understanding of severe postpartum psychiatric disorders. Unlike postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis is considered a psychiatric emergency. Although relatively rare, it carries a substantially increased risk of suicide, and in uncommon, but tragic circumstances, harm to children if left untreated. The warning signs can include hallucinations, fixed false beliefs, confusion, disorganized thinking, insomnia, and rapidly fluctuating moods. Many women experiencing postpartum psychosis never become violent. With prompt recognition and appropriate treatment, recovery is often possible. Nevertheless, untreated or inadequately treated psychosis represents one of the most serious psychiatric emergencies associated with childbirth. During this period, Andrea's treatment changed. Some medications were adjusted. Hospital stays ended. She returned home. As often occurs with chronic psychiatric illness, periods of apparent stability alternated with periods of deterioration. Then another major life event occurred. Despite earlier medical concerns, Andrea became pregnant again. Mary was born in November 2000. Initially, family members hoped the birth would proceed without serious complications. Instead, Andrea's psychiatric symptoms gradually returned. Her father, with whom she reportedly shared a close relationship, became gravely ill. When he died in March 2001, Andrea experienced another profound emotional loss. According to later testimony, her behavior changed noticeably after his death. She became increasingly silent. She sometimes refused food. She appeared emotionally detached. She reportedly scratched at her skin and remained motionless for long periods. Most concerning of all, she began expressing beliefs that reflected a severe break from reality. Physicians admitted her to psychiatric facilities more than once during the months preceding June 2001. Treatment temporarily improved her condition. Yet after discharge, her symptoms repeatedly worsened. Mental health professionals documented continuing concerns regarding her safety and her ability to care for herself. As the spring of 2001 turned into summer, Andrea's condition remained unstable. The family's routine continued outwardly. Children played. Meals were prepared. Appointments came and went. Neighbors saw little reason to expect the catastrophe that would soon unfold. Yet beneath that appearance of normal family life, serious psychiatric illness continued to shape Andrea's perception of reality in ways that were becoming increasingly dangerous. The warning signs had accumulated over months and years. Hospital admissions, suicide attempts, psychotic symptoms, medical recommendations, family concerns. Each event formed part of a larger pattern that would later be examined in extraordinary detail by investigators, psychiatrists, attorneys, judges, and jurors. In hindsight, those pieces appear connected. At the time, however, they unfolded gradually, one difficult day after another, inside a family struggling to understand an illness that was becoming more severe despite repeated efforts to treat it. The months leading to June 20, 2001, would ultimately become one of the most closely studied periods in forensic psychiatry, because they revealed how devastating consequences can emerge when severe mental illness progresses despite medical intervention, family support, and ongoing clinical care. By the spring of 2001, life inside the Yates household had settled into a routine that, from the outside, appeared orderly. The children followed a predictable schedule. Meals were prepared, lessons were taught at home, errands were completed, and neighbors occasionally saw the family going about ordinary activities. There was little outward indication that one member of the household was experiencing an increasingly severe psychiatric illness. Behind closed doors, however, Andrea Yates' mental health continued to deteriorate despite repeated treatment. Her physicians had already identified her condition as serious. She had experienced episodes of major depression with psychotic features, had attempted suicide, and had required hospitalization on multiple occasions. Although medication had previously led to improvement, psychiatrists understood that her illness could recur, particularly after another pregnancy. Their concern was not based on speculation, but on Andrea's own medical history and the established clinical understanding of postpartum psychiatric disorders. After the birth of her daughter Mary in late 2000, family members gradually noticed changes that resembled her earlier episodes. Initially, those changes were subtle. Andrea appeared increasingly withdrawn. She spoke less than usual. Activities that had once been routine became more difficult to complete. As weeks passed, the symptoms became more pronounced. One of the most significant events during this period was the death of Andrea's father in March 2001. According to family members and later testimony, she had shared a close relationship with him. His death represented a profound emotional loss at a time when her mental health was already fragile. Following his passing, Andrea's condition worsened markedly. Medical records and witness testimony described behavior that deeply concerned both relatives and healthcare providers. She reportedly stopped eating regularly, remained silent for extended periods, and became increasingly detached from those around her. At times she appeared unable to engage in ordinary conversation. She sometimes sat motionless for long intervals, showing little response to people nearby. Psychiatrists later explained that severe depression accompanied by psychosis can produce symptoms far beyond sadness. Individuals may lose the ability to organize their thoughts, struggle to distinguish reality from false beliefs, and experience overwhelming feelings of guilt or hopelessness that bear little relationship to actual events. Andrea was hospitalized again during this period. Treating physicians adjusted her medications and monitored her closely. During inpatient treatment, her symptoms showed some improvement, as they had during previous hospitalizations. Once stabilized, she was discharged home with recommendations for continued psychiatric care and medication. This pattern, hospitalization, temporary improvement, discharge, and relapse, would become a recurring feature of the months preceding the tragedy. Experts later emphasized that psychiatric recovery is rarely a simple, linear process. Symptoms may improve substantially while underlying vulnerability remains. Careful monitoring, consistent treatment, and ongoing assessment are often necessary, particularly for patients with histories of severe psychotic illness. Another issue examined during later legal proceedings involved Andrea's medication. Some reports indicated that changes had been made to her treatment plan in the months before June 2001. As is common in psychiatric practice, physicians adjusted medications in response to changing symptoms and clinical judgment. During later court proceedings, experts debated the significance of those changes, but there was broad agreement that Andrea remained a patient with an exceptionally high risk of recurrent psychiatric illness. Family members also faced difficult decisions. Caring for 5 young children while supporting a spouse with severe mental illness placed enormous demands on the household. Rusty Yates continued working outside the home, while relatives attempted to provide assistance whenever possible. Testimony later indicated that Andrea's mother planned to spend portions of the day with her so that she would not be left alone for extended periods. These arrangements reflected awareness that Andrea required supervision. Nevertheless, complete supervision 24 hours a day is difficult for most families to maintain over long periods, particularly when symptoms fluctuate between apparent stability and severe deterioration. As the weeks passed, Andrea's thoughts became increasingly influenced by delusional beliefs. One characteristic of psychosis is that false beliefs often feel completely real to the person experiencing them. They are not simply mistaken opinions or exaggerated worries. Instead, they become fixed convictions that persist despite evidence to the contrary. Later psychiatric evaluations concluded that Andrea developed religiously themed delusions. She reportedly believed that she had become an unfit mother, and that her own spiritual condition endangered her children. Mental health experts explained that these beliefs reflected the illness itself rather than reasoned religious conclusions. Psychosis frequently adopts themes that are personally meaningful to the affected individual. For some patients, delusions involve government conspiracies or surveillance. For others, they involve financial ruin or imagined medical conditions. In Andrea's case, her long-standing religious beliefs became intertwined with severe psychiatric symptoms, producing distorted conclusions that bore little resemblance to reality. This distinction became central during both criminal trials. The prosecution argued that Andrea understood the wrongfulness of her actions because of certain behaviors before and after the deaths. The defense argued that her psychotic illness had destroyed her ability to distinguish moral reality from delusional beliefs. These competing interpretations would ultimately shape years of legal debate. In the weeks before June 20th, family members continued searching for ways to help Andrea. Medical appointments continued. Treatment continued. Yet improvement remained inconsistent. Retrospective reviews of the case often ask whether additional hospitalization might have prevented the tragedy. Mental health experts caution, however, that such questions are difficult to answer with certainty. Clinical decisions depend on the information available at the time, and predicting individual acts of violence, even among patients with severe psychiatric illness, is extraordinarily challenging. It is also important to place Andrea's illness in a broader medical context. Postpartum psychosis is rare, affecting only a small percentage of women after childbirth. Most women experiencing postpartum depression or anxiety never become violent toward themselves or others. Public health experts have repeatedly emphasized that the overwhelming majority of mothers with postpartum mental health conditions are loving caregivers who benefit greatly from early diagnosis and treatment. The Yates case became internationally known precisely because it represented an exceptionally uncommon and catastrophic outcome. By June 2001, however, Andrea's treating physicians had already recognized that her illness belonged among the most severe forms of psychiatric disease. Her history included multiple suicide attempts, repeated psychiatric admissions, persistent psychotic symptoms, documented medical concern regarding future pregnancies. These were not isolated incidents, but components of a prolonged and complicated illness. The family's daily routine nevertheless continued. Children laughed, played, and learned. Ordinary household responsibilities filled each day. To neighbors passing by, the home appeared much like any other family residence on the street. Nothing visible suggested that one of the nation's most consequential criminal cases was only days away. On the morning of June 20th, Rusty Yates prepared to leave for work. According to later testimony, the family's schedule called for Andrea's mother to arrive approximately an hour later to remain with her daughter and grandchildren. For a brief period that morning, Andrea would be alone with the children. Investigators later reconstructed this timeline with remarkable precision, because those 60 minutes became the focus of extensive forensic analysis. Every telephone call, every arrival and departure, every statement, every documented movement, all would later be examined repeatedly during police investigations, psychiatric evaluations, and courtroom testimony. Yet before any of those investigations began, before detectives photographed the house, or attorneys prepared legal arguments, there remained only a quiet suburban morning and a family following what seemed to be another ordinary day. No one outside the home could see the extent to which Andrea's perception of reality had become distorted by illness. No neighbor could observe the private struggle unfolding inside her mind. No passerby could anticipate that within the hour, emergency responders would be summoned to one of the most heartbreaking scenes they had ever encountered. The next chapter of this case begins with those critical 60 minutes that would forever change the lives of the Yates family, challenge long-held assumptions about criminal responsibility and severe mental illness, and become one of the most closely examined timelines in modern American forensic psychiatry. Long before their names became known across the United States, the 5 Yates children were simply children. They were brothers and a baby sister growing up together in a modest home in the Houston area. Their days were shaped by routines familiar to many young families: breakfast around the kitchen table, lessons at home, toys scattered across the floor, children's books stacked on shelves, and the constant movement that comes with raising multiple young children under one roof. When the public first encountered the case, much of the attention focused on Andrea Yates, the criminal investigation, and the later courtroom proceedings. Yet the center of the tragedy was not the legal debate or the psychiatric diagnosis. At its heart were 5 young lives that ended before they had the opportunity to discover who they would become. Understanding who they were, even through the limited public record, helps place the case in its proper perspective. The oldest child was Noah, born in 1994. At 7 years old, Noah had begun developing his own interests and personality. Family photographs and accounts presented during later proceedings showed a bright child who enjoyed learning. Because the Yates children were educated at home, Noah spent much of his day with his parents and younger siblings rather than in a traditional classroom. As the oldest, he naturally occupied a different role within the family. Older siblings often become helpers without realizing it, fetching toys for younger brothers, or trying to imitate the responsibilities they observe in adults. Although still a young child himself, Noah was beginning to understand the world beyond the walls of the family home. He asked questions. He observed everything around him. He was old enough to recognize routines and notice when something felt different. His younger brother John was 5. Family members described him as energetic and curious. Like many children his age, he was constantly exploring, moving from one activity to another with enthusiasm that seemed impossible to exhaust. Children at 5 often live almost entirely in the present. Small discoveries become great adventures. A cardboard box becomes a castle. A blanket draped across 2 chairs becomes a secret hideout. Ordinary afternoons can feel enormous through the imagination of a child. Public records contain relatively few detailed descriptions of John's personality, but photographs preserved by the family show a smiling little boy growing up alongside his brothers. Paul, 3 years old, occupied the energetic stage between toddlerhood and early childhood. Children of that age are only beginning to understand independence. They want to dress themselves, choose their own toys, and imitate older siblings whenever possible. Every achievement feels important. Putting on shoes without help. Learning a new word. Stacking blocks a little higher than before. The world remains full of first experiences. Luke, 2 years old, was still discovering language itself. Much of life at that age revolves around curiosity. Every cabinet is worth opening. Every object becomes something to investigate. Parents of toddlers quickly learn that quiet moments often mean someone has found a new adventure somewhere in the house. Like many younger siblings, Luke was surrounded by older brothers whose games constantly introduced him to new experiences. Then there was Mary. She was only 6 months old. Her life had barely begun. At 6 months, infants are beginning to recognize familiar faces with increasing certainty. Smiles become more responsive. Laughter emerges more frequently. Parents often treasure this period because babies begin interacting more actively with the people around them while remaining entirely dependent upon adult care. Mary had entered a busy household already filled with 4 older brothers. Every member of the family adjusted to her arrival. Photographs from that period show an infant wrapped in blankets, held by family members, unaware of the extraordinary legal and medical discussions that would later surround her short life. Although each child possessed an individual personality, they also shared something many siblings experience. They were growing up together. Meals were shared. Stories were read aloud. Lessons happened around the same kitchen table. Arguments between brothers likely ended as quickly as they began. The ordinary rhythm of family life continued day after day. Because the children were homeschooled, they spent nearly all of their time together. Unlike children attending separate schools or extracurricular activities, the Yates siblings experienced much of childhood as a group. Morning routines blended into afternoon lessons. Outdoor play alternated with reading. Household chores mixed with games. The home itself became their classroom. Neighbors occasionally saw the children playing outside. Nothing suggested that they lived within a family facing one of the most serious psychiatric crises later examined in American criminal courts. Children, particularly young children, often remain unaware of the complexity of adult struggles. They notice changes in routine. They recognize sadness. They sense tension. But they rarely understand medical diagnoses or psychiatric illness. Mental illness can therefore affect an entire household, without children fully comprehending what is happening around them. This reality became painfully important in the Yates case. Medical records indicate that Andrea experienced periods during which she functioned relatively well, followed by episodes of profound psychiatric deterioration. During stable periods, she cared for her children and participated in daily family life. During severe episodes, however, her perception of reality became increasingly distorted by psychotic symptoms. Those closest to the family attempted to help. Hospitalizations occurred. Treatment continued. Relatives visited. Medical professionals monitored her condition. Yet maintaining ordinary life for 5 young children, while simultaneously managing severe psychiatric illness, proved extraordinarily difficult. As later testimony demonstrated, Rusty Yates faced responsibilities that many families confronting serious mental illness recognize all too well. He worked outside the home, while also attempting to support his wife's recovery. Family members contributed assistance whenever possible. Medical appointments became part of normal life. The household adjusted repeatedly to changing circumstances. Looking back, commentators sometimes portray the months before June 2001 as though disaster was inevitable. Historical evidence does not support such certainty. Psychiatrists who later reviewed the case emphasized that predicting specific acts of violence remains extremely difficult. Many individuals experience severe psychotic illness without ever harming others. Families frequently witness periods of deterioration followed by recovery. Hope often persists because improvement has occurred before. That complexity helps explain why the warning signs, though significant in retrospect, did not produce a single obvious solution. The children themselves continued growing. Birthdays were celebrated. Family photographs documented ordinary milestones. Baby clothes gradually gave way to larger sizes. Books appropriate for toddlers slowly joined early reading materials. The passage of time inside the household remained marked by childhood development rather than public attention. Only after June 20th did investigators begin reconstructing these ordinary details. Detectives interviewed relatives. Photographs were collected. Medical records were reviewed. Friends described the family as they had known them. Together, these accounts formed a picture far more complicated than early headlines suggested. The Yates home was neither defined solely by happiness nor solely by illness. It contained elements of both. There was genuine parental affection. There was sincere religious commitment. There were children experiencing ordinary stages of development. There was also a mother suffering from one of psychiatry's most severe disorders. These realities existed simultaneously. One did not erase the other. As the criminal investigation progressed, prosecutors naturally concentrated on establishing the facts surrounding the deaths. Defense attorneys focused on Andrea's psychiatric condition. Medical experts analyzed symptoms, diagnoses, medications, and treatment history. In doing so, much of the public conversation shifted toward legal responsibility and mental illness. Yet throughout every hearing, every appeal, and every psychiatric evaluation, the identities of the 5 children remained central. Their names were spoken repeatedly in court. Their ages reminded jurors of how young they had been. Family photographs quietly illustrated lives interrupted long before adulthood. For surviving relatives, the legal outcome could never restore what had been lost. Whether the case ended in conviction, or a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, 5 children would not return home. That reality shaped every stage of the proceedings that followed. Today, when psychiatrists, legal scholars, and historians discuss the Andrea Yates case, many begin by acknowledging the children whose deaths transformed a private family crisis into an international discussion about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Their lives were brief. Public information about each child remains limited, in part, because they were so young. They left behind no careers, memoirs, or long histories from which to reconstruct detailed biographies. Instead, they are remembered through family photographs, the memories of relatives, and the profound impact their loss had on everyone connected to the case. As this story moves forward, attention will inevitably turn to the morning of June 20, 2001, and to the investigation that followed. Before examining those events, however, it is worth pausing to remember that the case did not begin as a headline or a legal precedent. It began as the story of a family. 5 children shared a home, learned together, celebrated birthdays together, and experienced childhood side by side. Whatever conclusions are ultimately drawn about mental illness, medical care, or criminal responsibility, the enduring significance of this case rests first with those 5 young lives, whose absence continues to define one of the most consequential and heartbreaking cases in modern American legal and psychiatric history. As investigators reconstructed the months leading to June 20, 2001, they found themselves examining 2 stories unfolding at the same time. One was visible to anyone who visited the Yates home, 5 children growing up together under the care of devoted parents, who had chosen a quiet, faith-centered life. The other story was largely invisible. It unfolded inside Andrea Yates' mind, where severe psychiatric illness gradually altered her ability to perceive reality. Understanding those final months requires careful attention to the documented medical record rather than hindsight alone. After a tragedy, it is natural to search for a single missed opportunity, or one decision that might have changed everything. In reality, the events leading to June 2001 developed over an extended period, shaped by repeated episodes of illness, treatment, temporary improvement, and relapse. Following the birth of her 4th child, Luke, Andrea experienced symptoms that were far more severe than ordinary postpartum depression. Medical records and later testimony described persistent insomnia, profound depression, social withdrawal, and psychotic features. She attempted suicide more than once and required psychiatric hospitalization. These events established a clear history of serious mental illness years before the deaths of the children. During treatment, psychiatrists prescribed medication intended to reduce psychotic symptoms and stabilize her condition. While hospitalized, Andrea often improved. She became more communicative, her thinking appeared more organized, and some of the most severe symptoms subsided. These improvements offered hope to both her family and her physicians. Yet experienced psychiatrists also recognized that improvement did not necessarily mean recovery. Severe psychiatric illnesses often fluctuate. Patients may appear stable for weeks or months before symptoms return unexpectedly. Successful treatment depends not only on medication, but also on careful follow-up, consistent monitoring, and the willingness to reassess when warning signs reappear. Court testimony later revealed that physicians had expressed concern about Andrea's future pregnancies. Based on her medical history, they believed another pregnancy could substantially increase the risk of another psychiatric crisis. Such recommendations reflected established medical understanding rather than certainty about any particular outcome. Despite those concerns, Andrea became pregnant again. Mary was born in November 2000. Like the births of her older brothers, Mary's arrival was initially welcomed by the family. Publicly available records indicate that relatives hoped Andrea would remain stable while adjusting to caring for a newborn alongside 4 young sons. Instead, the months following Mary's birth became increasingly difficult. Medical experts later described this period as one of progressive psychiatric deterioration. Andrea became quieter. Family members noticed that conversations grew shorter. Her appetite reportedly declined. She appeared emotionally detached from activities that had once occupied much of her day. Then another profound loss occurred. In March 2001, Andrea's father died after a prolonged illness. Relatives later described the event as deeply painful for her. Although grief alone cannot explain what followed, psychiatrists testified that significant emotional stress can worsen severe psychiatric disorders in vulnerable individuals. Following her father's death, Andrea's condition reportedly deteriorated further. She sometimes remained silent for long periods. She withdrew from normal interaction. Medical records described increasing concern among healthcare providers regarding her mental state. She required additional psychiatric hospitalization. These hospital admissions became an important part of the later legal proceedings, because they demonstrated that Andrea's illness had already been recognized as severe before June 2001. Treatment again produced partial improvement. She returned home. For a time, daily life resumed. The children continued growing. Rusty continued working. Relatives remained involved. Yet the underlying illness had not disappeared. One of the most significant aspects of this case is the distinction between depression and psychosis. Depression, even when severe, primarily affects mood, motivation, energy, and emotional well-being. Psychosis, by contrast, affects an individual's perception of reality itself. Hallucinations, delusions, and profoundly disorganized thinking may emerge, making it difficult, or impossible for the affected person to distinguish reality from false beliefs. Psychiatric experts who evaluated Andrea concluded that she experienced psychotic symptoms involving intense religious themes. According to court testimony, she came to believe that she was an inadequate mother whose spiritual failings endangered her children. These beliefs were not based on observable reality, but were understood by experts as manifestations of severe mental illness. Such delusions differ fundamentally from ordinary religious faith. They are fixed false beliefs maintained despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. This distinction became central to the legal question that would later confront 2 separate juries. Did Andrea understand that her actions were legally and morally wrong? Or had psychosis so distorted her perception of reality that she could no longer make that distinction? Before those questions reached a courtroom, however, family members continued attempting to manage an increasingly difficult situation. Rusty Yates later acknowledged that caring for his wife while supporting 5 young children presented extraordinary challenges. Like many families confronting serious mental illness, they relied upon a combination of medical treatment, family assistance, and hope that improvement would continue. Andrea's mother also played an important role. According to testimony presented during the investigation, arrangements had been made for her to spend time with Andrea during the day. These visits were intended to provide support and reduce the amount of time Andrea spent alone while caring for the children. Such arrangements reflected awareness that her condition required close attention. Even so, maintaining continuous supervision is rarely feasible over extended periods. Mental illness does not follow predictable schedules. Symptoms fluctuate. Some mornings begin quietly. Others deteriorate rapidly. Family members often make decisions based on the person's condition at that particular moment rather than on distant possibilities. Looking back with knowledge of the outcome can create the impression that warning signs pointed inevitably toward tragedy. Mental health professionals caution against that assumption. Although Andrea's psychiatric illness was undeniably severe, acts of violence remain uncommon even among individuals experiencing psychosis. Predicting precisely when or whether violence will occur remains one of the greatest challenges in forensic psychiatry. As spring turned into early summer, daily routines continued inside the Yates household. Children played together. Lessons continued. Meals were prepared. Visitors occasionally stopped by. Neighbors observed nothing suggesting that catastrophe was imminent. The contrast between ordinary outward appearances and severe internal psychiatric deterioration became one of the defining features of the case. By June 2001, Andrea had been evaluated repeatedly by mental health professionals. Her diagnosis was well documented. Her prior suicide attempts were known. Her hospitalizations had been extensive. The seriousness of her illness was not disputed. What remained uncertain was whether treatment and family support would succeed in preventing another crisis. The answer would come on the morning of June 20th. Investigators later reconstructed that morning with extraordinary precision. Telephone records established the timing of calls. Family members described the usual household schedule. Police reports documented when officers arrived. Every minute became significant, because understanding the sequence of events helped investigators establish exactly what had occurred. Those facts would later be presented to juries, reviewed by appellate courts, analyzed by psychiatrists, and discussed in medical journals around the world. Yet before the legal arguments began, before expert witnesses took the stand, and before the case became a landmark in discussions of postpartum psychosis, there remained only a family whose private struggle with severe mental illness had reached a devastating turning point. The next stage of this documentary examines the investigation itself, how first responders documented the scene, how detectives established the timeline, and how the evidence shaped one of the most closely scrutinized criminal cases in modern American history. Rather than presenting mystery where none existed, the investigation focused on understanding the sequence of events and the psychiatric condition that would ultimately become the central issue in both the courtroom and the broader public conversation. The morning of June 20, 2001, began much like countless other mornings inside the Yates household. There were no reports of arguments heard by neighbors. No signs of forced entry would later be found. The house stood in the quiet Clear Lake neighborhood just as it had every other day, surrounded by families beginning their normal routines. Parents left for work, children prepared for summer activities, and traffic gradually increased along nearby streets as Houston awakened. Inside the Yates home, however, the circumstances were unusually fragile. Andrea Yates had been struggling with severe psychiatric illness for months. She had recently experienced repeated hospitalizations, and family members remained concerned about her condition. According to testimony presented later in court, a routine had developed in which relatives attempted to spend portions of the day with her so that she would not be left alone for extended periods while caring for the children. That morning, Rusty Yates left for work at approximately 9 a.m. The plan, as later established during the investigation, was for Andrea's mother to arrive roughly an hour afterward. It was intended to be a relatively brief period in which Andrea would be alone with the children before another adult arrived. Nothing about the schedule appeared extraordinary. It was simply another weekday. Yet investigators would later determine that this narrow window became one of the most significant periods in the entire case. Because Andrea survived and spoke with investigators, and because telephone records documented the timing of several calls, detectives were able to reconstruct the general sequence of events with unusual accuracy. Unlike many homicide investigations that begin with uncertainty about who was present or what occurred, this case quickly shifted away from identifying a suspect and toward establishing an exact timeline supported by physical evidence and witness statements. During later psychiatric interviews, Andrea described experiencing beliefs that investigators and mental health experts recognized as psychotic delusions. She reportedly believed she had failed as a mother. She believed her own spiritual condition endangered her children. According to expert testimony, these beliefs reflected a profound break from reality rather than conclusions based on observable facts. Psychiatrists later explained to the court that severe psychosis can fundamentally alter judgment. Individuals may sincerely believe ideas that are objectively false, and may make decisions based upon those false beliefs. The central question for clinicians was not whether Andrea held these beliefs. They concluded that she did, but how those beliefs affected her understanding of reality at the time. The precise chronology inside the house was reconstructed primarily through Andrea's later statements, physical evidence, and investigative findings. While some details were carefully examined during both criminal trials, investigators agreed on the overall sequence of events. What emerged was not evidence of panic or an impulsive confrontation. Instead, the investigation suggested a tragic series of actions occurring within a relatively short period while no one else was present in the home. When the events had concluded, Andrea did not leave the residence. She did not attempt to conceal what had happened. Instead, the next documented stage of the timeline came through telephone calls. At approximately 10 a.m., emergency services received a call requesting police assistance. Dispatchers recognized that the caller sounded composed, although the information being reported was deeply alarming. Emergency personnel immediately began responding to the address while attempting to gather additional information. Shortly afterward, Andrea also contacted her husband. Rusty later testified that the conversation immediately conveyed that something was terribly wrong. Although the exchange was brief, he understood that he needed to return home immediately. As police officers approached the residence, they had only limited information available. Calls involving possible family violence require officers to prepare for a wide range of situations. They must consider the possibility of an injured suspect, surviving victims needing urgent medical attention, or other unknown dangers inside the residence. Officers entered with those possibilities in mind. The scene they encountered quickly established that there had been no burglary, no home invasion, and no indication that an unknown assailant had entered the house. Andrea remained at the home. She did not resist the officers. According to police reports, she complied with instructions and made statements acknowledging responsibility for what had occurred. Investigators immediately secured the residence and requested additional personnel. Crime scene specialists, homicide detectives, photographers, and medical examiners would all become involved over the following hours. Although the identity of the person responsible was established almost immediately through Andrea's own admissions and the physical evidence, standard investigative procedures still required meticulous documentation. Every room was photographed. The positions of objects were recorded. Telephone records were preserved. Witnesses were identified. Medical personnel confirmed the deaths of the children. These procedures serve several purposes beyond determining who committed a crime. They ensure that the evidence accurately reflects the scene, allow forensic experts to reconstruct events independently, and preserve information for future judicial review. In this case, those records would later become critically important because the central legal issue was not identity, but mental state. Throughout the remainder of that day, investigators interviewed family members, neighbors, and medical professionals. Rusty Yates returned home shortly after receiving Andrea's call. His statements to detectives became an important component of the investigation because they helped establish the family's recent routine, Andrea's medical history, and the arrangements that had been made for supervision during the weeks before the tragedy. Relatives also described Andrea's recent psychiatric decline. They spoke about hospitalizations, medication, periods of improvement followed by renewed deterioration. Their accounts closely matched medical documentation that investigators would later obtain through legal process. The investigation therefore expanded beyond the events of June 20th itself. Detectives began gathering years of psychiatric records, hospital admissions, physician notes, prescription histories, clinical evaluations. This broader picture became essential because prosecutors and defense attorneys alike understood that the case would almost certainly involve extensive expert testimony regarding Andrea's mental condition. Meanwhile, the deaths of the 5 children sent shockwaves through the local community. News organizations rapidly arrived outside the neighborhood. Television cameras lined nearby streets. Reporters attempted to understand how such an extraordinary tragedy could occur inside what appeared to be an ordinary suburban family home. Public reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. Many people struggled to reconcile two seemingly incompatible facts. On one hand, 5 children had died in circumstances that demanded accountability under the law. On the other, investigators were already confirming that the person responsible had a long, well-documented history of severe psychiatric illness. That tension would define public discussion from the earliest days of the investigation. Some observers focused primarily on the unimaginable loss suffered by the children and surviving family members. Others immediately questioned whether the mental health system had failed to protect both Andrea and her family. These conversations unfolded long before any jury heard evidence. Investigators, however, remained focused on facts rather than public debate. Their responsibility was to determine what had happened, collect evidence impartially, and present a complete record to prosecutors. Within a remarkably short period, detectives concluded that there was no factual dispute regarding responsibility for the children's deaths. The evidence consistently pointed in one direction. The remaining questions were no longer investigative mysteries, but legal and psychiatric ones. What was Andrea Yates' mental state at the time? Did severe psychosis prevent her from understanding the nature or wrongfulness of her actions? Or, despite her illness, did she retain sufficient awareness to meet the legal standard for criminal responsibility? Those questions could not be answered by detectives alone. They would require extensive psychiatric evaluation, expert testimony, and ultimately decisions by judges and juries. The investigation that followed therefore became unlike most homicide investigations. Instead of searching for an unknown offender, investigators assembled one of the most comprehensive collections of medical, forensic, and psychological evidence ever presented in a Texas criminal courtroom. That evidence would soon become the foundation for one of the most closely watched criminal trials in the United States, a trial whose outcome would influence legal discussions about severe mental illness for years to come. Within hours of the emergency call, the Yates residence had become one of the most carefully documented crime scenes in Texas. Uniformed officers secured the property while homicide detectives, crime scene specialists, and representatives from the medical examiner's office began their work. Although Andrea Yates had acknowledged responsibility almost immediately, investigators understood that every homicide investigation required a complete and objective examination of the evidence. Their task was not simply to confirm what had happened. They also needed to establish a timeline supported by physical evidence, preserve every relevant detail for future court proceedings, and determine whether the available evidence was consistent with witness statements. The first observations were significant for what they did not reveal. Investigators found no indication of forced entry. Doors and windows showed no evidence of tampering. There were no signs suggesting that an unknown individual had entered the residence. Likewise, detectives reported no evidence of a prolonged struggle involving multiple people. These findings quickly narrowed the scope of the investigation. Attention then turned to documenting the condition of the home itself. Crime scene photographers recorded every room before anything was moved. Investigators carefully noted the location of furniture, household items, personal belongings, and any objects that might later assist forensic reconstruction. Such documentation is standard procedure, because even seemingly insignificant details may later become important during courtroom testimony. Telephone records were also preserved early in the investigation. Those records confirmed the sequence of calls made after the events inside the home. They helped establish a reliable chronology that could later be compared with statements provided by Andrea, Rusty Yates, emergency dispatchers, and responding officers. As detectives continued processing the residence, investigators interviewed the first responders who had entered the home. Their observations were remarkably consistent. Andrea remained at the scene. She complied with police instructions. She did not attempt to escape. She did not accuse another person. Instead, according to official reports, she acknowledged responsibility from the outset. Cases involving immediate admissions are relatively uncommon in homicide investigations. Even when suspects eventually confess, investigators ordinarily seek independent evidence to confirm every significant aspect of the account. Confessions alone are not considered sufficient. They must be evaluated alongside physical evidence, forensic findings, and witness testimony. That process unfolded over the following days. Medical examiners conducted autopsies to determine the causes and approximate timing of the children's deaths. Their conclusions were consistent with the investigative timeline established through witness interviews and physical evidence. Meanwhile, detectives began expanding the investigation beyond the events of June 20th. They requested Andrea's medical records, hospital admissions, psychiatric evaluations, prescription histories, treatment notes. These documents would prove essential, because nearly every professional involved in the case recognized that Andrea's psychiatric history would become central to any future prosecution. Investigators soon discovered that the mental health record extended back several years. There had been multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, documented suicide attempts, repeated diagnoses of severe mental illness, recommendations from treating physicians. These records established that Andrea's psychiatric condition was neither sudden nor previously unknown. The investigation also examined the family's daily life during the months leading to the tragedy. Friends, relatives, neighbors, and healthcare providers were interviewed. Witnesses generally described the Yates family as private, but devoted to their children. Neighbors reported routine interactions typical of suburban life. Children played outside. Parents came and went. Nothing had suggested imminent violence. Relatives described a more complicated picture. They acknowledged growing concern regarding Andrea's mental health. Several recalled periods during which she appeared withdrawn or emotionally detached. Others described improvements following psychiatric treatment, followed by additional declines after returning home. This pattern closely matched the medical documentation obtained by investigators. One issue that received particular attention involved supervision. Evidence indicated that efforts had been made to ensure Andrea was not left alone with the children for extended periods while her psychiatric condition remained unstable. On the morning of June 20th, however, there was a brief interval between Rusty Yates leaving for work and Andrea's mother arriving at the house. Detectives carefully established this timeline through interviews and telephone records. Although the period lasted only about an hour, it became one of the most extensively analyzed aspects of the investigation, because it defined the opportunity during which the tragedy occurred. As public attention intensified, news organizations from across the country arrived in Houston. Daily coverage expanded rapidly. Television networks reported new developments almost every evening. Newspapers devoted front-page coverage to the investigation. Public discussion soon extended beyond the facts of the case. Many commentators asked whether warning signs had been overlooked. Others questioned whether additional psychiatric treatment or longer hospitalization might have prevented the tragedy. Medical experts cautioned against drawing simplistic conclusions. Psychiatric illness, particularly psychosis, does not progress in identical ways from one patient to another. Even experienced clinicians cannot predict with certainty which individual patients will later become violent. The Andrea Yates case therefore presented questions extending beyond traditional criminal investigation. It required collaboration among detectives, forensic specialists, psychiatrists, prosecutors, and legal experts. As investigators reviewed years of psychiatric records, another important issue emerged. Several treating physicians had reportedly expressed concern regarding future pregnancies because of Andrea's history of severe postpartum psychiatric illness. Those medical recommendations later became widely discussed during court proceedings and in public debate. Investigators themselves, however, remained focused on documenting rather than interpreting those records. Their role was to preserve evidence, not to determine medical responsibility. That distinction would become important as the case moved toward trial. Prosecutors and defense attorneys each assembled teams of psychiatric experts to review the same records while reaching different legal conclusions. The prosecution accepted that Andrea suffered from mental illness, but argued that she nevertheless understood the wrongfulness of her actions. The defense maintained that severe psychosis had fundamentally impaired her ability to distinguish reality from delusion at the relevant time. These competing interpretations transformed what initially appeared to be a straightforward homicide investigation into one of the most significant insanity defense cases in modern American history. As weeks passed, detectives completed the factual portion of their investigation. The timeline had been reconstructed. Witness interviews had been conducted. Forensic examinations had been completed. Medical records had been collected. There remained little dispute regarding the sequence of events. Instead, attention increasingly shifted toward the legal process that lay ahead. Texas law recognizes a narrow insanity defense requiring jurors to determine whether a defendant, because of severe mental disease or defect, knew that the conduct in question was wrong at the time it occurred. This legal standard differs from a medical diagnosis. A psychiatrist may diagnose psychosis, depression, or another serious disorder. A jury, however, must answer a different question, whether that illness met the legal threshold established by state law. The distinction between medical illness and legal responsibility would dominate every stage of the proceedings that followed. By late 2001, prosecutors had formally prepared the case for trial. Defense attorneys assembled extensive psychiatric evidence. Expert witnesses from both sides reviewed thousands of pages of medical records, hospital notes, prescription histories, and interview transcripts. Each expert agreed on one point. Andrea Yates had been profoundly mentally ill. Where they disagreed was whether that illness removed criminal responsibility under Texas law. The courtroom would ultimately become the place where medicine, law, ethics, and public opinion converged. What began as a meticulous homicide investigation was now evolving into a landmark legal battle, whose consequences would extend far beyond a single Texas courtroom. The first trial would attract national attention, expose sharply conflicting expert opinions, and ultimately produce a verdict that, years later, would itself become the subject of intense judicial scrutiny. As the initial investigation came to a close, the focus shifted from the crime scene to the courtroom. Detectives had reconstructed the timeline, interviewed witnesses, secured physical evidence, and obtained Andrea Yates' extensive medical records. There was little uncertainty regarding who had caused the deaths of the 5 children. The central question that remained was one that no fingerprint, photograph, or laboratory analysis could answer. What was Andrea Yates' state of mind on the morning of June 20, 2001? That single question would determine the direction of one of the most closely watched criminal cases in modern American history. In many homicide investigations, prosecutors devote months to proving identity or demonstrating that a suspect intentionally committed the crime. In this case, Andrea's identity as the person responsible was never seriously disputed. She had remained at the residence, contacted emergency services, and acknowledged responsibility to responding officers. The physical evidence was consistent with her statements, and investigators found no indication that another individual had been involved. Instead, prosecutors faced a different challenge. Texas law recognizes an insanity defense, but the legal standard is deliberately narrow. It is not enough for a defendant to suffer from mental illness, depression, or even psychosis. The legal issue is whether, because of a severe mental disease or defect, the individual knew that the conduct was wrong at the time it occurred. This distinction is often misunderstood outside the courtroom. Medical professionals diagnose illnesses. Courts determine legal responsibility. A psychiatrist may conclude that a patient experiences hallucinations, delusions, or profound cognitive impairment. A jury must then decide whether those symptoms satisfy the legal definition established by state law. From the earliest stages of the prosecution, everyone involved understood that psychiatric testimony would become the foundation of the case. The Harris County District Attorney's Office began assembling evidence that would support a prosecution for capital murder. Under Texas law, the deaths of multiple victims under these circumstances qualified for one of the state's most serious criminal charges. At the same time, defense attorneys began conducting their own extensive review of Andrea's psychiatric history. Thousands of pages of medical documentation were collected. Hospital admission records, physician progress notes, medication histories, psychiatric evaluations, nursing observations, emergency room reports. Each document represented a snapshot of Andrea's condition at a particular moment over several years. Together, they created one of the most comprehensive psychiatric records ever examined in a Texas homicide prosecution. Forensic psychiatrists, retained by both sides, began reviewing those materials independently. Although they would later disagree on important legal conclusions, there was substantial agreement regarding the basic medical history. Andrea had experienced repeated episodes of severe depression. She had attempted suicide. She had undergone multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. She had exhibited psychotic symptoms. These facts were well documented and largely undisputed. Where expert opinions diverged was in interpreting what those records meant on June 20, 2001. The prosecution accepted that Andrea suffered from severe mental illness. Their argument, however, was that mental illness alone does not automatically eliminate criminal responsibility. According to prosecutors, certain actions before and after the death suggested planning and awareness. These observations would later be presented to jurors as evidence that Andrea understood the wrongfulness of her conduct despite her psychiatric condition. The defense approached the evidence from a different perspective. Defense experts argued that Andrea's actions could not be understood without considering the profound psychosis documented throughout her medical history. They emphasized repeated hospital admissions, persistent delusions, suicide attempts, and recommendations made by treating physicians long before the tragedy occurred. According to the defense, the available evidence demonstrated that Andrea's illness had progressed to the point that her perception of reality had become fundamentally distorted. As preparations continued, investigators also interviewed Andrea repeatedly. These interviews differed significantly from traditional criminal interrogations. Because Andrea had already acknowledged responsibility, detectives were less concerned with obtaining a confession than with understanding the sequence of events and documenting her explanations. The interviews were later reviewed not only by investigators, but also by psychiatrists, psychologists, attorneys, and eventually jurors. Experts paid careful attention to her language. How did she describe the events? Did her explanations remain consistent? Did her statements reflect organized reasoning or evidence of psychosis? These questions became increasingly important as trial approached. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued interviewing family members. Rusty Yates cooperated extensively with investigators. His testimony helped establish the family's routine, Andrea's medical treatment, and the events leading up to June 20. Relatives described both Andrea's devotion to her children during healthier periods and the frightening psychiatric symptoms they had witnessed during episodes of illness. Friends and neighbors also provided context. Most described the family as private, but caring. Few reported observing behavior that would have suggested violence. Many expressed shock upon learning what had occurred. These accounts reinforced one of the case's defining characteristics. To the outside world, the Yates family often appeared ordinary. The extraordinary crisis was unfolding largely within Andrea's mind. Public interest in the case continued to grow. National newspapers assigned investigative reporters. Television networks aired interviews with psychiatrists, legal scholars, and family acquaintances. Medical organizations began discussing postpartum psychiatric disorders more openly than they had before. For many Americans, the case introduced terms such as postpartum psychosis into public conversation for the first time. Mental health professionals frequently reminded journalists that postpartum psychosis is exceptionally rare. They stressed that most mothers experiencing postpartum depression or anxiety never become violent and should not be viewed with suspicion or fear. The Yates case represented an extraordinary, an uncommon circumstance rather than a typical outcome of postpartum mental illness. These distinctions were important because psychiatrists worried that sensational media coverage might discourage struggling mothers from seeking treatment. Within the legal system, however, the discussion remained focused on evidence. The court appointed schedules for expert disclosures. Medical records were exchanged. Psychiatric evaluations continued. Attorneys prepared motions addressing what evidence jurors would be permitted to hear. As trial preparations advanced, another challenge became apparent. Jurors would be asked to evaluate highly technical psychiatric testimony. Terms such as psychosis, delusion, major depressive disorder, and postpartum illness carry precise clinical meanings that differ from everyday language. Attorneys on both sides therefore prepared to translate complicated medical concepts into explanations understandable to individuals without psychiatric training. Expert witnesses would play an unusually prominent role. Unlike many criminal cases in which forensic scientists explain fingerprints or DNA evidence, psychiatrists would spend days describing symptoms, diagnoses, treatment history, and the relationship between mental illness and legal responsibility. Their testimony would shape how jurors interpreted nearly every major piece of evidence. The courtroom itself became the next stage of the investigation. Instead of detectives asking questions, attorneys would examine witnesses under oath. Instead of crime scene diagrams alone, jurors would review years of medical documentation. Instead of focusing solely on physical evidence, the proceedings would explore the complex intersection of psychiatry, law, ethics, and criminal responsibility. As opening statements approached, neither side disputed that an immense tragedy had occurred. 5 children had died. Their family had been devastated. Nothing presented in court could alter those facts. The dispute centered on a far narrower, but enormously consequential, legal question. Did Andrea Yates, because of severe mental disease, lack the capacity to understand that her actions were wrong under Texas law? Or, despite overwhelming evidence of psychiatric illness, did she still retain sufficient awareness to be held criminally responsible? The answer would not come from public opinion or media commentary. It would be determined inside a Texas courtroom, where 12 jurors would hear weeks of testimony from detectives, physicians, psychiatrists, family members, and expert witnesses before reaching one of the most consequential verdicts in the history of American criminal law. When the trial of Andrea Yates began in 2002, it immediately attracted national attention. Courtroom seats filled quickly with journalists, legal observers, medical professionals, and members of the public. By that point, the basic facts of the case were not in dispute. Andrea Yates had acknowledged responsibility for the deaths of her 5 children, and the physical evidence gathered by investigators was consistent with that account. The central issue before the jury was therefore not identity, or the sequence of events. Instead, jurors were asked to resolve a far more complex legal question: whether Andrea Yates, because of severe mental illness, was legally responsible for her actions under Texas law. The prosecution and the defense agreed on several important facts. Both accepted that Andrea had an extensive psychiatric history. Both acknowledged multiple hospitalizations, previous suicide attempts, and documented diagnoses of severe mental illness. The disagreement centered on the legal significance of that history. Under Texas law, the insanity defense requires more than proof that a defendant suffers from a serious psychiatric disorder. The legal standard asks whether, at the time of the offense, a severe mental disease or defect prevented the defendant from knowing that the conduct was wrong. This distinction became the foundation of nearly every argument presented during the trial. Prosecutors argued that Andrea's behavior before and after the events demonstrated an awareness of wrongdoing. They pointed to actions they believed reflected organization and decision-making, as well as her communications with emergency services and her husband after the incident. Their position was that, although Andrea was undeniably mentally ill, the evidence showed she still understood that her actions violated both the law and accepted moral standards. The defense presented a different interpretation. Defense attorneys argued that Andrea's long history of psychiatric illness could not be separated from her mental state on June 20, 2001. They introduced extensive medical records documenting years of treatment, repeated psychiatric admissions, medication changes, and evaluations by treating physicians. Expert witnesses explained that psychotic disorders can profoundly distort a person's perception of reality, causing individuals to act according to fixed false beliefs rather than objective facts. Several psychiatrists testified regarding Andrea's documented symptoms, including severe depression, psychosis, and religiously themed delusions. They explained that postpartum psychosis, while rare, is recognized as a psychiatric emergency because it can involve hallucinations, delusions, and a complete loss of reality testing. They emphasized that the diagnosis itself does not determine legal responsibility, but provides important medical context for understanding the defendant's mental condition. Throughout the proceedings, jurors heard testimony from family members, investigators, physicians, and mental health experts. Each witness contributed a different perspective on the months preceding the tragedy. Medical professionals described treatment decisions and clinical observations. Detectives explained the investigative process and the evidence collected at the residence. Family members recounted Andrea's declining mental health, her hospitalizations, and the efforts made to obtain treatment. One witness whose testimony became particularly influential was psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, who testified for the prosecution. During his testimony, he referred to a television episode that he believed illustrated a mother with postpartum depression avoiding criminal responsibility after harming her children. He suggested that Andrea might have been influenced by such a portrayal. At the time, this testimony was presented without challenge. However, after the trial concluded, it became clear that the television episode Dr. Dietz described had never actually been broadcast in the form he had stated. This factual error would later become one of the most significant developments in the entire case. Despite the conflicting expert opinions, the jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense during the first trial. In March 2002, Andrea Yates was found guilty of capital murder. Because prosecutors had not sought the death penalty, she received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after the period specified under Texas law. The verdict generated immediate public discussion. Some commentators believed the jury had correctly applied the legal standard, distinguishing between the presence of mental illness and legal insanity. Others argued that the overwhelming psychiatric evidence demonstrated that Andrea's illness had profoundly impaired her ability to perceive reality. The case also intensified national conversations about postpartum psychiatric disorders. Medical organizations used the public attention to educate healthcare professionals and the public about recognizing severe postpartum mental illness and the importance of early intervention. Experts repeatedly emphasized that postpartum psychosis is rare and that most mothers experiencing postpartum depression or related conditions never become violent. Although the trial had concluded, the legal process was far from over. Defense attorneys carefully reviewed the record for possible errors. Among the issues that drew particular attention was the inaccurate testimony concerning the television program. Appellate courts would later consider whether that incorrect information might have influenced the jury's assessment of Andrea's mental state. Within a few years, the case returned to the courts. The appeal would not revisit the tragedy itself, nor would it dispute the established facts of the investigation. Instead, it would examine whether Andrea Yates had received a fair trial under the law, and whether the erroneous expert testimony required the conviction to be set aside. That appellate decision would fundamentally change the course of the case and ultimately lead to a second trial with a very different outcome.